Andy Piziali is a 40-year student of economics, monetary systems, taxation, and political theory. He grew up with his wife Debbie in Buffalo, New York, eventually settling in Parker. It's 1990. He's retired from the semiconductor industry, and he is a co-founder of Patriots, which got started in 2009. He divides his time between leading a Christian life group and campaigning and consulting on politics. We are delighted that he is here with us tonight to give us practical and useful information about our property taxes. Please give Andy a warm welcome.
As I mentioned, the topic is going to be property tax, and the provocative title, which I will be explaining shortly, is Homeowner or State Tenant. And what we're going to talk about this evening is, first of all, Texas property tax, and we'll go back in some history and look at what are the origins of property tax, both worldwide and then focus in on Texas. We'll look at some of the injustices in the property tax system, which is providing a motivation for looking at either reforming or replacing property tax. And finally, near the end, I'll talk about some of the things you can do working with initially our state Senate and as well as the House, which needs even more motivation to address this situation we have with escalating property taxes. So, Texas property tax has a process, and there are taxpayers and what are often called taxing entities. I would prefer to call tax consumers, right? A school district or a city or a county are the consumers of your tax dollars, and you are the taxpayers. So let's look initially at some historical trivia and some things that are important. My position, and I'm not sure as an Allenary patriot if it's yours, that taxation is theft. And why do I say that? Because if I ask you, is it wrong to take your neighbor's money? How would you answer?
Yes.
Is it wrong to pay someone to take your neighbor's money? Then is it wrong to elect somebody to take your neighbor's money? Yes. So the point there is that what is wrong for an individual to do is wrong for a collective to do also. Okay, and we tolerate a certain amount of legalized theft, and we're going to talk about how to minimize that. Okay. Tax records. What are the earliest tax records? They date back just past Adam and Eve, actually. Okay, remember Adam and Eve, right? They disobeyed their creator. They got booted out of the garden. Not more than a few hundred years later, there was a tax collector, and in the city of Lagash, Iraq, which is just northwest of the Tigris and the Euphrates, those ought to be familiar. Old tax records are found on stone tablets. Okay, so taxation is indeed ancient. I learned that the Rosetta Stone is an exemption document, a religious exemption document written in several languages that documents why this particular religious organization is not liable for tax, property tax. Throughout history, land and its production value were taxed. As you'll recall, in ancient history, and even in more modern times, agriculture played a primary role. And so the production value of land was the basis upon which tax was levied. So if 1,000 bushels of potatoes could be taken off the land, then the appraiser came in and said, how many bushels of potatoes did you produce? And the value of your property was based upon that production value. We're going to be talking primarily about tax on real property, that is real estate, right? Land and the structures on there. But property tax also includes personal property tax, and there are states that levy a personal property tax. And in fact, in the history of Texas, there were counties that were levying taxes on personal property. Property tax is an ad valorem tax. What does that mean? It's a tax on according to the value of the property. If I were to ask you, what is the value of your home? You're going to give me a dollar figure, right? $250,000, $300,000, some number. But how do we know what the real value of a home is in the marketplace? When is the true value actually established?
When you sell it.
When you sell it, exactly. There has to be a willing buyer and a willing seller, and a transaction has to take place. So all the values that we see, that is this ad valorem property assessment, is an approximation, right? We look at comparable sales that have taken place and we say, well, if Mr. Gordina or Mr. Duke were going to sell their property, they would probably get this amount of money for it. But we have to understand that it is indeed an approximation. Texas history, we'll look at the earliest years, and then we'll look at the history of property tax increases, how we stand nationwide in tax rankings, and then some of the revenue sources and what fraction of tax revenue that Texas as a state brings in, that is at all levels of government. Where does property tax fit? So you'll recall, all of you are Texans, I'm a transplant, that 6 flags have flown over this state, and one of them was Mexico. Mexico, in the years leading up to 1830, was trying to encourage people to settle in this state. And so they gave a property tax exemption, settler exemption. If you came here, you're not going to pay property for a few years. In 1830, they abolished that exemption. And that began a small tax revolt. And that tax revolt ultimately was a contributor to Texas declaring independence after a few battles in 1836. Between the years 1836 and 1940, property tax funded both state and local government. So you may not be aware of this, but property tax today does not fund any state government. It funds municipalities, your county, your school districts, your city, and some special municipal districts, which we'll look at. However, during the years following 1940 through 1978, there were wide disparities in how property tax was assessed. For example, there were counties in which the appraisal value was based on maybe half the value of a homestead or a farm. In other places, it was taxed at 100%. And what was taxed varied. A representative in 79 by the name of Wayne Heveo, I hope I have his name pronounced properly, introduced a bill, but in his writings about why this bill was needed, he said, some school districts tax chickens and others tax cars. Others only tax real property. So a lot of things were being taxed, and depending on what county you lived in is where you're going to be taxed. The other thing that was true at that time that has since changed is that the appraisal values, that is, the entity that was appraising the value of property, was also the entity and the individual was responsible for assessing and collecting that tax. And you can see that could lead perhaps to some biases that were not favorable to the taxpayer. This bill in 79 created the central appraisal districts, which we now call the CADs. Okay, so each CAD is generally associated with a county. I'm not sure if there are central appraisal districts that span multiple counties. This could be true in some of our western counties. State property taxation, that is, where the state was actually being funded by property tax, was abolished in 1982. Any questions on Texas history and property taxation? So let's look at what's happened to property tax since 2000. There are earlier records, but the top line, first of all, the bottom scale is from the year 2000 to 2013, the most recent records I was able to find. The top blue line is local property tax and the rate that they were increasing. So it's been approximately 2x over that period of time, 100%. The middle line that crosses back and forth over the red is state sales tax. The sales taxes have increased by 86% in those 13 years. If you look at simply combined population and inflation, and you picked up an average property tax, a median property tax back in 2000, and you simply indexed it to population growth and inflation, then the tax rate would have been up 70%. Now, a good question to ask is, given that we're going to be making use throughout the rest of this presentation an elastic yardstick, right? Our unit of currency, the dollar, has devalued over the years, right? Starting in 1913 through today, it's lost a little over 90% of its value. So you have to ask, between the years 2000 and 2013, what has been what we commonly call the inflation rate, or the price inflation rate. And it's been about 35%. Okay, so 35% of the increases that you're seeing are simply because the dollar has shrunk, and so the number of dollars it takes to equal whatever figure you're picking is an additional value, right? Additional amount.
Andy?
Yes.
In regard to the state sales tax, can you address the fact that the state sales tax vary?
It has varied, right? So as you know today, the state takes 6.25% of your state sales tax, and then you might have another percent due to the city and a percent typically due to DART, okay? So there have been variations, and Joe, I don't have the numbers in terms of how the rate has changed, but if we just look at the aggregate over that period, it's been about 86%. Where does Texas stand nationwide in the tax ranking? So this map of the U.S. is color-coded, where the states that are the darkest blue have the lowest property tax, and the states that are the closest to white have the highest property tax. So Texas currently ranks number 5 in terms of the highest property tax in the nation. Okay? The states, notice additionally, that are immediately adjacent to us have much lower property taxes. In fact, if I've got my geography right, north of the panhandle of Florida, is that Alabama? Has got a very low property tax. To be fair, if you dig into the overall tax burden, these states had, of course, other taxes, not only in income tax. What about the revenue sources statewide? For Texas, property tax pulls in just under half of all revenues collected from taxpayers. About a quarter is taken in state sales tax, a little less than a quarter in other state taxes, and this would be fees also. So for example, your gasoline tax, energy taxes, utility taxes, and then finally local sales tax, which is that 1 or 2%. I'm in Parker has 1% sales tax, consumes about 7% of that tax slice. So let's transition to who are the players in the tax process. Who is involved and what are those entities? We have an appraisal district, an appraisal review board, and the tax consumers, those taxing entities. So the appraisal district is responsible for valuing the property, right? So annually, and we'll look at the cycle in a moment, they look at your home relative to other homes and try to determine has that home appreciated or depreciated. Both the land and the structures on that property are taken into account. They administer both exemptions as well as what we'll see are deferrals. So there's a number of exemptions that we'll look at, and that some you need to requalify on a yearly basis, others are permanent until you die, death and taxes, right? And they also maintain ownership information, so they're tied into the titling process. The Appraisal Review Board, or the ARB, is who writes to you and lets you know if you want to dispute your tax appraisal, they're going to settle disagreements between the property owner and the appraisal district. When I have personally spoken with appraisers, they always prefer that you meet with them several months in advance of the legal deadline in which you need to, if you can actually contest, because oftentimes you can settle a discrepancy between what you believe your property ought to be assessed at and what the appraisal review board does just in an office visit, okay? And the reason they encourage that is there's a cost involved to the ARB and ultimately to you to having the disputes and the resolution process, right, with an ARB hearing. And then we've got the tax consumers, right? The tax consumers are responsible for setting tax rates, school district, county, city, municipal districts such as hospital districts, right? Each of those set tax rates, and you nominally have some control over this tax rate. But how much influence do you believe you have? I mean, do you think that it's difficult or not so difficult to prevent a tax rate increase? Let's say the city of Allen is going to raise taxes, or Brenda mentioned that the Lovejoy ISD wants to raise the tax rate. How difficult is it to prevent that tax increase from going through? Easy or hard?
Extremely difficult.
Extremely difficult. So why is it so difficult?
Because in our school district, we don't have a local newspaper, and the school district has refused to notify the citizens of a tax increase election, only the parents.
Exactly. So that's one powerful influence, the fact that information is not out there, the taxpayer doesn't know. I would argue that another strong influence is that those who benefit from a tax increase, that is, the tax consumers, have a much more powerful motivation to ensure that that tax increase goes through than the taxpayers. But why is that? Because the number of people that are going to benefit from that tax increase is a very small number. If you look at the employees of a school district, the teachers, the administration staff, talking about a few hundred or a few thousand. Compare that to the number of taxpayers who are going to be on the hook for paying that additional fee. So if you're going to earn, let's say individually, $100 or $500 a year because you put a lot of time into trying to get a tax increase through, are you going to be motivated to do that? Or let's say the tax increase results in costing you an additional $3 a year as a taxpayer because there's several hundred thousand of you, or maybe even more. In which person, the person who's going to be, it's going to cost them a small amount, or the individual who's going to benefit tremendously is more motivated to argue the cost? The consumer, right? The taxing entity. So that's a principle of distributed costs, concentrated benefits that drives systemically in all situations when there's a taxpayer and a tax consumer. And it's something that we as taxpayers need to work tremendously hard at overcoming, right? Because we have a leverage disadvantage. So the tax cycle, I hope the font looks pretty small, so I'm going to read these boxes to you. So the tax cycle begins January 1st. The appraisal districts are required to appraise property at its value on this date. Our current state constitution says that all property must be appraised at 100% of its value. That has not always historically been true. A lien is attached to taxable property to ensure that that property tax will be paid, right? If you don't voluntarily, quote unquote, pay up, you will pay ultimately through the foreclosure of that home. Between January 1st and April 30th, appraisal districts complete those appraisals and process applications for exemptions. During the April and May time frame, notices are sent of appraised value. So that's when you receive your green sheet, Steve. The green sheet, I think, that has your appraisal value on it. May 1st, the appraisal review boards begin hearing protests. So between April and May is where you could visit your appraiser and find out what information did you use, right? What comparable properties were used. And in most appraisal districts, that information will be shared with you, the taxpayer. In the August and September time frame, local taxing units adopt their tax rates. So why does that take place after May 1st, right, or the April-May time frame? Because at this point in time, the taxing entities have some notion of how much revenue will be collected from the property within their geographic taxing area. Okay, and they can set a tax rate in combination with the appraisal values that will determine, okay, what tax rate do we need to meet our budget. October 1st, the local taxing units for county assessor collection begin sending their tax bills to property owners. I should note that in some counties, such as ours, we have a tax assessor that performs that function for all the taxing entities, right? The community college, the school district, the city, the county. That tax bill is all handled through the tax assessor. You write your check to Kenneth Mon and you hope he doesn't spend it in his personal account. In other areas of Texas, those the taxing entities themselves, the city or the county, they collect the tax. January 31st of the following year. So let's say we're looking at October 1st of 2016, January 31st of 2017, right? Taxes are due to the local taxing units. February 1st of that following year, the local taxing units begin charging penalty and interest for unpaid tax bills. July 1st of the next year, following year, You may be imposed additional penalties to pay for collection costs, and hopefully it ends before then, because ultimately people are evicted. We'll talk about that. I want to relate a good story I heard yesterday. How many people were at the property tax hearing in Arlington yesterday? Anybody else? Okay. So those of us that were there heard both a heartbreaking and a heartwarming story. In one of the more rural taxing districts, counties, a couple who was undergoing, they had medical issues, and so they weren't always home. They were in and out of the hospital. They had a tax deferral in place, which we'll talk about in a moment, that allowed their taxes to be deferred into the future. And their tax deferral, for some reason, was not renewed, probably a clerical error. And a tax bill was sent, and when one of the husband or wife was home, saw the tax bill, they ignored it as they usually did, because they knew that their tax deferral was in place. Well, ultimately, while they were both hospitalized, the taxes became due. The house was foreclosed on, it was auctioned off, and it was purchased for like 30% of its value. And the homeowners who now were hoping to get back to their homes didn't have their home any longer. The tax appraiser in the district tried to negotiate with the buyer of the home and was able to release the house, but there is a redemption clause that if your house is foreclosed upon, then between 30 and 90 days you have the right to purchase the home back. He negotiated with the new homeowner to sell the home back, and I think the additional cost involved was somewhere in the neighborhood of $3,000. And the chief appraiser and the deputy appraiser, between them, wrote a check for $3,000 to put that couple back in their home. And so there are real people with real hearts that are working there. Sometimes we don't think so, but when we hear stories like that, we need to remember that those are individuals. They're not just faceless bureaucrats. The ARB, I should mention, are volunteers, right? The Appraisal Review Board, those are volunteer people from your community that typically have a little bit of experience, perhaps, in real estate. They're not paid for their job, and they are doing a civic duty. Any questions on this process? I've got some references at the end of this presentation, so I'll point you at a location where you can read in detail what happens at each of these steps. It's at the Central Appraisal District website for Collin County. So what about taxpayers? Who are the taxpayers? We have residential taxpayers, that's most of us. Commercial property is also taxed, but there are a number of exemptions, right? There's a residence homestead exemption if you live in your property. That homestead exemption is a dollar figure that was raised in the last legislative session from $15,000 to $15,000 to $25,000. It's a small amount, but it's a step in the right direction. However, because it's not an indexed amount, that is, it's in 2016 dollars, that's going to become less and less of a benefit in the years to come as our dollar devaluates. There are a number of veterans exemptions. Charitable organizations such as 501c3s that own property are exempt. Community land trusts, religious organizations such as churches, private schools, and of course public property are all exempt in one way or another. I'm going to talk about not the exemptions too much, but two of the deferral processes that are available in a moment. And then we have the tax consumers. Looking around, I think I found the best illustration of a tax consumer on the right there. It's just a black hole. School districts consume 55% of our total property tax. So, as you know, I happen to be in the PISD, Plano Independent School District, and the lion's share of the taxes we pay goes to PISD. Maintenance and operations, M&O, is one of the two segments of like the school district's costs, right? The maintenance and operations is taking care of the infrastructure, right? The buildings, repairing the buildings, paying the salary of people who take care of the buildings. S&I, which is sink and interest, I believe, is typically known as capital. So when a tax entity like a school district says we need to build a new school, that falls under S&I. So buildings, roads are also under, typically, sometimes INS is the term used. also. So if you see those terms, you know what they mean. Cities, counties are each tax consumers, and you've got your special purpose districts, such as a community college, right? This is a property part of a community college. Your hospital districts and municipal utility districts. A typical municipal utility district, we have, I think, at least one in Parker, Joe, which is for sewage, is a local geographic area, and let's say this set of homes in this new development all have sewer. Most of Parker is on septic systems. They decide they're going to put in sewer. Then the cost of operating that sewage treatment facility and maintaining it is handled by MUD, utility district, and those individuals see that additional assessment on their property tax. Any questions about your tax consumers? No. Okay. So let's look at then some of the injustices in property tax. We've looked at some history. We've looked at how the process works. What's wrong with it? Why is there an interest in reform or replacement? The tax percentage of median income, the property tax percentage, has increased from 7.5% to 10% between the year 2000 and 2014. And so if you look at the real fraction, that's a 33% increase in tax, right? Is that we're paying a much larger fraction of our income in property taxes. Homeowners pay rent. I mean, if you do not pay your property tax bill, you will be evicted. Is this any different than you as a tenant in an apartment failing to pay your rent after a few months? Absolutely not. The only difference is that the entity to which you're paying the rent happens to be a governmental agency versus a private or commercial landowner. Okay, and I'll talk in a moment about some title differences, but most property that we own today is subject to effectively a rent. Right, a lien can be attached to it, and you're going to be responsible for paying or being evicted. Another injustice is that the taxpayer and tax consumer are decoupled, right? I mean, if I've got, let's say I have 12 kids, right? I have 12 cousins in one family, for example, right? They were getting their money's worth in their property tax in their taxing district with respect to education, right? And then you have other families with no children or one, and they're paying, if they're in the same valued property, they're paying the same amount of money and getting not that same value for the service that's being provided. So there's that decoupling. Retirees that live nominally on fixed incomes are getting priced out of their homes. We'll talk a little bit about that. And there is one escape clause, which is a tax deferral, which I learned about just recently in a lunch with actually Judge Bill Whitehill, which he got me onto that, so I'm going to share that with you also. So homeowners do pay rent. There are two types of titles. Is there anybody here that has done any reading about titles, right? Property titles. Like, where do titles come from? Right? What's the purpose of a title company? Right? What does a title company do? They try to make sure maybe your title doesn't have any liens attached to it, right? But titles, any one of your properties, if you research the title history, it ultimately goes back to a Western European country. And if you dig further, it even goes further back, okay? Well, in looking at titles, there are two common types of titles in the United States. One is called an allodial title, sometimes called a land patent, and the other is a fee simple title. An allodial title is a title that's very close to a ownership of property that cannot be assessed. It cannot incur a debt from any other entity. Okay? Most allodial titles today are held by either a state or a nation state, like the United States itself. Okay? But if we look at the earliest days of the United States, the railroad companies, for example, who were going to acquire lots of land to put a railroad across the United States, were given land patents. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to afford ultimately the property tax and the land on either side of their rail, right? On the other hand, in contrast, a fee simple title is a title in which liens can be assessed against it, and you're in the renting class. Although I have a paid off mortgage as of 2000, but that only relinquished me from the mortgage company, right? They still owe the taxing entity. The title holders are either a mortgage company or a homeowner. I guess there are, as I think about it, you've got reverse mortgage options available in which you can be selling a mortgage back to ultimately an entity that's going to own your property after a long period of time. What is the process by which a homeowner could lose the property? Well, a tax is assessed. The tax could be then unpaid. It becomes delinquent. A warrant is issued. And then the property is auctioned. Okay? And if you get on the Collin County website, it'll point you to one of your constable districts. You go to the constable's website, you will find a listing of the homes that are being auctioned off in the next month due to delinquent taxes. And those properties are available at a fraction of the cost. The buyers are not popular, obviously, okay? But people are, it's a sad situation that people are losing their property because they can't pay the rent on it. What about the decoupling between the taxpayer and the tax consumer? The property tax, as we talked about earlier, is based on the value of land, not upon the services rendered, right? And you talk to people. I talk to my dad. My dad's 85, going to be 86, and we talk about property tax and a zillion other things. And in his opinion, he says the reason we tax property, it's easy to find, right? If you're going to tax people, right, you got to track them down. But your property, it stays where it is. You just need to figure out on a record who owns it, and you pay the bill, right?
That's brilliant logic. I mean,
It doesn't. It does not really.
it's great.
Another reason that property tax is popular to the tax consumers is that a third of mortgage holders bundle property tax as part of the escrow payment. And so the homeowner doesn't have a clear idea. It's not front and center in front of them how much property tax they're paying. Right? Each month they pay a little bit. It's part of their mortgage payment. And if it increments 10% a year, they don't see it. Okay. I already touched on the point about households without children paying the school tax. Let's talk about, from the progressive side, this is a quote out of Foreign Affairs, an article called The Baby Gap that was published in 2012. Why do we justify taking money from everybody and sending it to school districts that benefit some people? Because children were a crucial investment to society, but an economic burden to individual families, the argument ran, the government needed to redistribute wealth from households with few or no children to those with many. So how does that sit with you?
Not well.
Right. I mean, are we a capitalist society or a socialist society? Socialism, of course, a proponent, we have a major presidential candidate that wants to redistribute wealth. At least he claims it on his party banner, right? But we have many other individuals that they are also willing to redistribute wealth. Well, we as fiscal conservatives, right, people who believe in personal responsibility, need to think long and hard. Do we continue sanctioning long-term public education, or do we find a way for parents to educate their children and assume personal responsibility for doing so? I did look in the Texas State Constitution to find out what responsibility does the state have in the area of education. And I was hoping that what I would read is that the state must ensure that children have a means to be educated in Texas. But it's more specific. The current Texas State Constitution says that Texas must provide free public education.
And that's in the original also.
And in the original also?
76, yes.
Okay, thank you, Barbara. So if we're going to tackle this problem of carving out some area of socialism for education, then we're going to have to look at ultimately convincing Texans or the state legislature that the Constitution needs to be changed. And it's another whole conversation whether you do that quickly or slowly. And then we've got people in relatively fixed incomes, right? So a retiree is living on a nominally constant dollar, which is a fixed income, right? That dollar, because our central bank finds it reason to create more dollars on an annual basis, causes the devaluation of the dollars that each of us hold, and so we need to spend more of them to buy the same product, right? So that's inflation, price inflation. So that really hurts your retirees, but if the retirees are not only living on a fixed income, but they're seeing their property tax rise, ultimately they can be pushed out of their homes. There is little flexibility for financial hardship, right? What if in a given year you're not a retiree, but you lose your job and you're out of your job for 6 months or a year and a half, okay? How do you deal with that? Well, there's one option that I'll bring to your attention in a moment. And people are evicted weekly in Collin County for failure to pay back taxes. You're not going to see it in the media. You're not going to see it in the Dallas Morning News. You're not going to see it unless you dig for it, right? Because it's a dirty little secret that's a consequence of our current property tax system. And I think I'll ask you the question: should homeowners be evicted because they can't pay their rent?
That's tough.
Yeah, it's tough, right? I don't know. If you don't evict, then
Nobody pays.
nobody pays, right? So there is an escape clause for the retiree, right? A senior can postpone paying property tax until their death. Remember that old saying about there's no certainty but death and taxes? Okay, so this has been codified in Texas. Interest accrues at 8% per year, okay? And it does prevent the senior from eviction at a substantial cost to their heirs. So I ran the numbers on our home, right? So our home currently appraised around $300,000. Our property taxes are about $6,000 a year. So if you go on a compound interest calculator and you punch in $6,000 and you assume, which is an optimistic assumption that the property tax remains at $6,000 a year over a 30-year period, and you're paying 8% interest, and let's say I live another 30 years, how much is due at that point in the future at the year 2046? About $500,000. So you're going to lose the home. You're not going to pass that property on to your heirs. So, but it is a way, you know, if you've seen the bumper stickers on the back of RVs that I'm spending my children's inheritance, this is another way to do it. The homeowner can also defer their taxes, right? You're not a retiree, but you earn a pinch. You can't pay your bill, so you can file what's called a tax deferral affidavit, and you'd be responsible for paying property tax on the following year on 105% of the prior year's appraisal, and that property tax is deferred but not canceled, and the interest would continue to accrue at 8% a year, and that deferred tax and interest would also be due upon sale or death. Okay, so you can get the details at the CAD website. So keep that in mind that you or somebody you know, or your kids or grandkids, is in a tough spot. They might lose their home. They can file for a deferral at a cost.
Andy, who sets the 8% as the number?
That is also in Texas state law. In fact, I think it's in the Constitution, Joe, at 8%. In both cases, the retirees as well as the deferral. Yes?
Would it make more sense to tie that to prime?
Would it make more sense to tie to the prime rate?
Yeah, I mean, that seems like an easy thing to suggest to Van Taylor.
Absolutely. I would bring it to his attention. Van is all ears on this whole property tax issue. He publishes his cell number too, so you just want to give him a call him and suggest it. I think it's a great idea. So I've given you some of the motivations for reforming or replacing sales tax. Let's look at some of the reform proposals. Some that I thought I had thought of, but I discovered other people have thought of them too, and others. So
It doesn't mean you didn't think of it.
I didn't think of it, right? So three possibilities that come to mind are, each one is motivated to try to keep the property tax bill on an annual basis simply in line with some measure of the inflation rate, okay? Obviously, the tax consumers are going to incur additional expenses annually, right? The additional expenses is just because the dollar is becoming worth less, right? So if they had $1 million budget this year, they may have $1.5 million budget next year, right? So three ways to do that, and there may be others. The first is to index the tax assessment ratio to appraisal changes. And I'm going to talk about each of these in more detail. The assessment ratio is what fraction of your property is assessed, right? The whole value or some fraction of it. Cap the property appraisal increase to the inflation rate, right? So you can appraise it for a larger amount, but it has to be capped. Or index the tax rate of each of the taxing entities to inflation. And then we'll look at some objections. Now, since we're going to be tying in the inflation rate, I've chosen to use the Consumer Price Index. And there are actually two kinds of CPIs. There's one for clerical workers, and then there's one for the rest of us, which is about 87% of the people. You may have read that the CPI has been, and is continued to be monkeyed with over the years. It currently excludes a large amount of energy and food in the basket of goods that's used to calculate how much prices are increasing on an annual basis. So you may see a CPI advertised for 2015 of 2.5%, but your family budget, your basket of goods, went up 10% maybe, right? The reason is that the CPI is not actually accurately reflecting your own cost. And each of us, I'll mention this in passing, each of our basket of goods is different, right? I mean, you know, the Duke household doesn't buy the same basket of things on a monthly basis that the Piziali household does, right? So inflation rate is really a personal thing, but if we're trying to get it to be accurate, at least it should include what most people buy. They buy gasoline, they buy electricity, they buy food, right? So those should be included in the CPI. They are not currently. And then I'm going to look at some objections to reforms. So the first is indexing the assessment ratio. First of all, the state constitution prohibits assessment ratio, so it would have to be repealed. Right? Property tax has to be assessed at 100% of the value of property, both commercial and residential property. So we would need to repeal that 100% clause. In this situation, we'd annually lower the assessment ratio in proportion to the increase in the appraised property value. And we would adjust for price inflation using the CPI. So I've got an example here. Let's see, this pointer shows up. Does that pointer show up on the screen?
Yes.
All right, great. So let's say in 2016, you've got a property, it's valued at $400,000. The aggregate tax rate of all the taxing entities is 2%. You don't ever see it as 2%, by the way. How do you see your tax rate? It's this obscure figure, which is so many cents per $100 valuation.
Per thousand.
Why is it? Do we have any realtors in the audience or somebody who would know why we don't just say your tax rate is 2%? Okay, well, I'm going to have to bring it up for somebody. I don't understand why that is. Initially, your assessment ratio would be 100%. This would be our base year. Let's assume a CPI of 5%, inflation rate of CPI. And your tax bill, work the numbers as $8,000. So next year, the appraisal value, right, this is the appraisal value is $450,000. And that's using the current ARB, the Appraisal Review Board, comps, all that, right? Your property went up in value. What does that work out to, Joe? I mean, it's a little over 10%. Yeah. Tax rate, we'll keep the tax rate the same. So we adjust the assessment ratio from 100% down to 89%. So only 89% of your home value, $450,000, is going to be subject to property tax. And if we do that, then your tax bill is going to increase to $8,400, which is simply 5% over the previous year. And likewise, the following year, the same thing takes place. So the assessment ratio would continue to be reduced on an annual basis to counteract the rising appraisal values, but to keep it in line with the CPI. Yes, sir.
Just by comparison, if you don't use an assessment ratio, your tax bill goes 8,000, 9,000, 10,000.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we've all seen those kind of bills going up.
And that's without a tax rate increase.
Exactly, right. And I don't know if I mentioned this in the presentation, but it certainly came up in the property tax hearing yesterday, that all of our taxing entities, these tax consumers, are seeing a budget windfall on a year-to-year basis simply because of the rise in appraisal values, right? So if we were to be fair, and I'm not going to point fingers at the county, but if the county sees their properties and their whole CAD go up 10%, and they knock the tax rate down by 1 point, let's say 1%, then they're seeing a huge budget increase, increase, right? And so we should
Hey, we
start
get
with a reduction in the tax rate that simply counteracts the appraisal increase. And then if we need to, let's say on a zero budget basis, we would then increase the tax rate or adjust it. So this is the first of three. Steve?
I know at the city, when, like this year, for instance, we're heading into the budget deal and we'll be getting our numbers pretty soon. Municipalities are required to, if say we have a large property value increase, we're required to lower the tax rate down to even again, okay? And only municipalities are forced to do that, and it's a great mechanism. We round it down and keep a few decimal places, you know, because we're allowed, but it forces the municipalities to actually operate within a budget. Now, if you have new building going on, you get to keep all that because it's new infrastructure into the total pie. But the school districts are seeing, especially over in the Lovejoy area, are some crazy increases in the property assessments, and it is nuts. So,
Absolutely. So I didn't realize that municipalities, state law dictates this?
yes.
Okay. Yeah, there's a provision that kicks in at 8% currently, which is called the rollback provision. That rollback provision says that if a taxing entity wants to raise taxes above 8%, then an election must be held and the voters have to approve that.
It's not an election must be held. An election could be held if you get enough signatures on a petition.
You're right, Howard, that's right. It allows the taxpayers to create to run a petition and then get sufficient number of signatures to do that.
And in Plano, the bar is too high. In Plano, it's got to be 10,500, which means about 12,000 signatures to make sure that they're all good, and you just can't get that many.
Right, that's one of the discussions, both the rollback rate at 8% and the number are both being discussed, Howard, in this select
Yeah,
state.
I saw Dan Patrick's testimony. He's talking about cutting the rollback rate back from 8 to 5
Right.
and making an election mandatory.
Mandatory.
Which would solve the problem, I think.
Absolutely, absolutely. Any other questions on indexing the assessment ratio? Okay, let's look at a second option. The second would be capping the property appraisal increase. Any California transplants in the audience? Okay, so I'll admit it. I spent time, Shane did too. Okay, so those of us from California have probably heard about Proposition 13. Back in '78, it was called the People's Initiative to Limit Property Taxation, and I think it was Laffer. Was it Howard Laffer? I'm trying to remember who started this tax revolt in California, but
Howard Jarvis.
Howard Jarvis. That's right.
It was the Laffer curve.
Right, that's right, we'll get to Laffer. Howard Jarvis, he was motivated, right? I mean, he was a taxpayer, right? He wasn't tax exempt, but he was motivated to limit property taxes. So the clauses that ended up getting passed in Proposition 13 froze the assessed value of property to the time of purchase, right? So I had friends that moved into their house in, 65, okay, and they bought the house for $35,000. And they're there 35 years later, and as we'll see in the second bullet point, there's a 2% cap on the annual assessment increase. And so their house is now assessed at $50,000 in a neighborhood in which houses on either side are being sold for $2 million. Okay. But it serves this fantastic purpose that when people retire, they can afford the house they live in, right? I mean, a 2/3 majority was required to raise the tax rate. Right, so that was at the state level, and so that was a high bar that was passed. And as a consequence, property taxes fell on average 57% in California in the following year. So if you Google this on the web, you're going to find all, depending on where people lie on the political spectrum, the disaster that Proposition 13 has caused and had. And it has a legitimate concern that Barbara brought up to me, which I'll touch on a little bit later, and that is the state got more heavily involved in funding municipalities and localities. But for the taxpayer, right, the tax burden is obviously reduced. So if we look at Prop 13 as an idea, yes, sir?
But when a property is sold, it's now assessed at today's value, so the new owner is paying current rates.
That's correct. And harkening back to a comment I made very early on, the true value of a home, right, the real value is what's seen at the time of sale, right? So Prop 13 basically says you can only assess the value of a home at its real value, the value at the time of sale.
But it stays fixed while he's in the house.
That's correct.
Yesterday in Arlington, do you remember that guy that talked, might not have been in your group, but one of your groups, and he talked about he was an appraiser, and he did an appraiser in one of these cities for like 20 years, and he gets up there and says, you know, I'm not here officially as an appraiser, but this appraisal system is broken.
Yes.
We guess at what your property value is. We have no idea what your property value is.
Yeah, there are certainly
Very
ARBs
illuminating. Yeah.
There are ARBs that are kind of broken. Yeah, one of the another comment that was made, and they're like in complete contrast to one another. One appraiser said that we are the benchmark for the nation, right? And then we have this other guy step up and said, well, the bar is low. Tracy.
One California transplant explained to me that there's Proposition 13 on business property as well in California. And that was recently rescinded.
Okay, so Tracy was saying that the Prop 13 also applied to commercial property in California, but that was recently rescinded.
And they are considering removing Proposition 13. And if that would happen in California, we're going to see a lot of people here.
Absolutely. So apparently the motivation, those that are trying to repeal the proposition are there. So what could we do in Texas to learn from this in terms of capping the property appraisal increase? One thing to do is we could cap the value, let's say it's a 2016 assessment, but then you would allow the annual appraisal to increase at a CPI or some number that is, again, going to allow the tax consumers to cover their rising costs, right? So an example here, which is similar to what we were using earlier, starting in 2016, a CPI of 5% per year, $400,000 home and a 2% tax rate, we start with an $8,000 bill. Well, if we cap that appraisal value at the CPI, the home can only be appraised at $420,000 in 2017 and at $441,000 in the year after that, thereby keeping those tax bills directly proportional to the inflation rate. So there's going to be a lot of ways to skin this cat, each have their pros and cons, but this is another possibility, capping that proper appraisal increase. Another way
that would require amending the Constitution.
Yes, that's correct. Right. A third idea would be to index the tax rate. So let's say, you know, the Collin College, right, sets a tax rate of some percent. And they decide that they've convinced their constituents, right, the people in that district, that we need that for our budget. Well, if that's true, then we ought to hold them to that budget on a year-to-year basis, right? And we will accommodate inflation. That means that tax rate has to be reduced annually, okay? So we would index that tax rate to the Consumer Price Index. So what does that look like? Again, with the example we were using earlier. Again, 2016, $400,000 house, 5% CPI. The 2% tax rate is an $8,000 tax bill, like we saw earlier. But the following year, the aggregate tax rate would only be allowed to rise to 2.1%. And each of the components, right, the city of Parker, PISD, right, the county, each of those would only see their tax rate rise a small amount, which is proportional to that 5% CPI. That would result in an $8,400 tax bill for the homeowner and $8,820 the year after that at a tax rate of 2.21%. So because there's multiple factors that go into calculating your tax bill, you can look at indexing each of them or in combination, right? The simpler would be the better, and there are pros and cons to each of these. This is a somewhat complex calculation because you got all these taxing entities involved, their tax rates would change. But as Steve pointed out, it sounds like at least for municipalities, there's already a mechanism in place that says if your property values go up a certain amount, you need to roll back the tax rate.
Or if you don't, then you're, I forget what percent it is, but you've got to have a tax election.
A tax election, okay. Any questions on indexing the tax rate? Sandy?
Figuring those figures out 10 to 20 years, what's your tax bill looking like?
Yeah, it's basically a compound interest calculation with no additional money being placed in each year, right? So I mistakenly, my wife saw this optimistic number I ran when I first did my $6,000, right? 30 years, 8%. I neglected to put in the additional $6,000 each year. And I said, well, look at that. 30 years out, we would only owe like $60,000. Like, wow, let's do it now, right? Wow. That's kind of the answer to your question, Sam. How are we doing on time?
I don't even know. I've been enjoying it.
8:15.
Thank you. All right, so what are the objections to tax reform? Local governments always claim they're underfunded. If you didn't have a chance to attend that select committee meeting, I would encourage you to at least skim through the video that we posted, especially when you get one of the taxing entities, the mayor of Plano, for example, a well-spoken guy, gave a talk, and in the end he said, we need the money, right? We got to have this money. We're providing services. He thinks he's running a business. He doesn't realize that the funds he has coming in are squeezed out of a rock. They come through coercion, whereas a business gets its money through persuasion, right? I mean, nobody takes your wallet when you walk into Walmart, right? So local governments claim they're underfunded. What is the answer? Fiscal discipline, cut waste, and abolish private sector viable services. I mean, why is the city of Plano building and increasing the size of the Carpenter Rec Center, which is a huge senior center, basically, okay, that competes with entities in the private sector? Or look at the fitness centers that Allen and Plano and the other cities have, Richardson, right? Compete one-on-one with 24 Fitness and some of these others, right? Why are they doing that? It's another aspect of redistributing, right? Taking from everybody and then spending the money on a select beneficiaries, right? Because that's a very vocal group. So there's the underfunding argument, right? We can't, and yet the examples that I'm giving, and I'll use these also in the abolishment of sales tax, are aiming at revenue neutral, right? We're just saying we don't want you to see tax increases. We don't want you to see revenue increases that are invisible or difficult to see for the taxpayer and not justified by your budgets. School districts claim they need more revenue, not less. I'll see the above, right? And Robin Hood, right? What is Robin Hood? Robin Hood is another redistribution scheme, right? And yet we've got 254 counties in Texas. We could abolish Robin Hood, and if you live in a poor county, move, right? If your schools are not good there, then move, or send your kids to a relative that lives in an eastern county and then bring them back in the summer, right? I mean, the fact that, and this is true at the national level too, that we have 52 states and we created a federalist system. So if you didn't like Virginia, you could move to Illinois. If you didn't like California, you could move to Texas, right? The same is true in a state with a lot of counties with respect to a taxing entity like a CAD or a county. So are there other objections to tax reform that y'all have heard?
It's for the children.
For the children. I see that on the billboards this election season. So let's look at something a little more drastic, and that is replacing property tax. Dan Patrick, and I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, Dan Patrick, when he ran for Senate, ran on a plank to abolish property tax in Texas. And as a senator, he's done a lot. As lieutenant governor, as a leader of the Senate, he's also trying to reform and ultimately abolish. And the abolish word, that A word, did come up a number of times during the committee hearings yesterday. And so I think that it's a possibility. What would we do? Let's look at some advice from the guy who was on the Economic Advisory Council for Ronald Reagan, Dr. Arthur Laffer, for whom the Laffer curve is named. The property tax is an unfair and inefficient way to fund government. Texas would gain hundreds of thousands of new jobs and tens of billions of dollars in personal income just by abolishing the property tax and replacing it with a revised sales tax. So let's look at that. Laffer, who's familiar with the Laffer curve? You heard of the Laffer curve, right? I mean, the theory is, right, Laffer's theory is that we've seen it in practice, that there's some tax rate which you maximize revenue, right? You tax below that rate, you get less revenue. You tax above that rate because taxing is elastic, and whatever you're taxing, you're going to get less of. You'll get less revenue also if you tax at a higher rate. So let's look at the revised sales tax and see what kind of objections are raised to it. So the proposal would be, and some of these comments are taken from the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and one of my links is going to, at the end, is from the TPPF. They've been an advocate of this for some time. We would be looking at a flat consumption tax, right? So Texans would choose their tax burden, right? When you, right now, your 6.25%, 7.25%, 8.25% that you spend, you look at your annual sales tax, you are primarily in the driver's seat of how much tax you pay, right? If you want to pay more tax, then spend more. If you want to pay less tax, then you spend less, okay? And for sales tax currently in Texas, as you know, food is exempted, and there may be some, some clothing might be, yeah.
Pharmaceuticals, Bibles.
Yeah, so there's some exemptions. There's pros and cons to some of the sales tax exemptions. I'm going to touch on those in a moment. So if we assume a revenue neutral substitution, we're going to give the school districts, the counties, the tax entities the same amount of money on an annual basis. What would that tax rate need to look? Well, if you had a broad tax base, and by broad I mean you tax everything, right? Services and products, retail level, not a VAT. Then you're looking at about an 11% tax rate, right? So if you add that 11% tax rate to the state, 6.25%, the sales tax you would see on a Walmart bill would be about 17%, okay? If you restricted the tax base, you carved out a bunch of exemptions, which has the big drawback that it becomes a political football, right? Once somebody says we shouldn't tax food, then we shouldn't tax candy, we shouldn't tax alcohol, or whatever. But if you start restricting it, then you restricted it back to our current exemptions. The tax rate could inflate up to 16%, right, in that substitution. I guess before I hit the objections, I should touch on, as an advocate of a revised sales tax, some of the positive things. Who is familiar with, at the federal level, a tax called the fair tax? It's a proposal that's been around for a number of years. It's usually introduced as HB 25 in Congress each year. So the fair tax is a national sales tax, retail level, and only on new goods, right? New goods period, so if you sell used things, you don't pay a tax. It would abolish all payroll taxes. It would abolish the IRS, it would abolish federal income tax, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, all of those, the income side of those taxes, right? Replace it with a flat 23% sales tax, okay? And some of the arguments in favor of the fair tax apply to a revised sales tax and replacing property tax. And I think front and center, the number one advantage is that the tax burden to the taxpayer is seen every time a purchase is made. Right? When you spend $100 in Walmart, you spend $117, $120. Why? Because $20 tax line is there. So if we're talking about transparency with respect to taxation, then no longer would a school district or a county be able to hide behind rising property values or even an unpublished tax rate increase. It would be seen right there on the tax bill. Okay? The other advantages from an economic perspective is that people would spend less, at least initially. Spending less means that money would be in the bank. Money in the bank goes to capital accumulation, which leads to lower interest rates for lending for growth in our economy. So let's look at the objections. Well, the sales tax rate is already 8.25%, right? If we look at Texas state sales tax nationally, we're one of the higher rates, right? Well, which is higher, your property tax bill or your annual sales tax bill? If you pay $8,000 in property tax, that equates to $40,000 of taxable purchases at a 20% tax rate. Are you spending $20,000 a year on taxable purchases? If you are, then it's a wash, right? But you can influence, you can pay more or pay less if you're paying sales tax. Retail sales will suffer is another objection. Initially, there will certainly be less money spent. But you have $8,000 more to spend each year if you own that $400,000 piece of property. And less spending, as I pointed out a moment ago, results in capital expansion, savings. And then there's always the local control argument. The local control argument was raised a number of times yesterday at the select committee hearing. And you know, in my mind, the closest, the most local you can get is these 2 feet, right? These sandals that I'm standing on. That's local, right? Local is you. You decide how much you're going to spend. But local control is the taxing entity, and they want to be able to control how much money that they bring in. Well, if it's sales tax, you're in the driver's seat, right? You're determining how much money is going to those taxing entities, not the local elected officials. So here's one of the gotchas. One of the gotchas is that the state would have to, in some manner, redistribute sales tax receipts from districts that have retail sales to districts that do not, right? There are a lot of places that don't have a lot of sales going on in their taxing area, but they've got expenses, they got local taxing entities, right, that need to be funded.
This is Robin Hood statewide.
It's very analogous to Robin Hood. One friend of mine by the name of Frank Kuchnev, he ran for Congress actually a few years ago under the Get Out of Our House program, had a suggestion, one of a number of ways to do this, and that is to start, let's say we did this 2016, so 2017 became the first year that you start funding with sales tax. What you would do is you look at a baseline, the previous year's tax receipts that were taken by each of the taxing entities. And those percentages, those fractions would be divvied up through so the state would take its 6.25% out of the 20, let's say, and then the remaining 14% would be sent to each of the counties and each of those taxing entities, such that the money they received was proportional to what they had received in the last year in which they were funded through property tax. And then each subsequent year, a similar thing would be done. Well, one of the drawbacks here is that, first of all, you're putting the state in control of that money. It's like nowadays we send money to Washington, and Washington sends money back to Texas. We would be sending through the sales tax system money to Austin, and then that money would come back to Allen and Parker, right, and Richardson. Well, once you get an entity like Austin involved, politics gets involved, right? And so that's one of the gotchas. If there are other ideas, I'd like to talk with you after this presentation on how you would address the loss of local control issue, in particular, dealing with the fact that you need to fund government at the local level, but in places that don't have retail sales. Any comments on the objections? Joe?
Just one comment. There are, throughout the state, I was president of the Small Cities Advisory Council, let's say. And when I did that, and I started looking across the state, all the different number of small towns that are out there, and what percentage of these towns had no retail sales. Or had a percent of retail sales, but it was negligible for all intents and purposes. It's very, very small. And it's alarming because they have nothing except the property values to really go on. 98% of their money is coming out of that home values. So that has to be a consideration. You can't just immediately say that large cities just have to just fork over the dough. You know? Right. So what it means is that the cities have to start to rethink their disposition relative to, we are a bedroom community. You are a bedroom community, but you have to have services and things of that nature. Selling, again, we're talking about...
Right, because the revenue source becomes now retail sales. Right, so Joe's point, if you didn't hear all the comments, is that this would be there are many rural cities that have zero or negligible retail sales, right? And so they would become immediately dependent on those funds they receive from the state through this process, right? And as a consequence, it would influence zoning and some of the other future growth opportunities. Other comments or questions? Yes, sir.
one of the other objections to this, and I'm not sure who buys it, but sales tax is inherently regressive.
What do you mean by regressive?
Poor people spend 100% of their income on taxable things. Rich people don't. Now, the rich people will, of course, spend a higher amount dollar-wise of taxes, but percentage-wise, this is a regressive form of taxation because it hits poor people harder.
Right, so that's the argument. The argument is that sales tax is a regressive tax because even though everybody, rich and poor, pays the same percentage, let's say we're 20%, the amount of money spent by the poor versus the amount spent by the rich is such that the rich are not spending all of their money, right, all of their income in an annual year. So in my position with respect to that is that it is a fair tax. It's fair not in the trademark name, but it's a tax in which everybody pays the same amount. And if you're spending all that you are earning, then you're paying that amount. And you are going to be powerfully motivated to move up the economic ladder so that you are spending, you have some money to save also, right? But it's a great discussion, right? The regressive argument, I hear it from a good friend of mine, for example, who calls himself a moderate Republican, right? So he's a liberal, right? But he votes oftentimes as he votes as a Republican because he wants to influence politics in Texas. So, one other question, Howard?
Yeah, the local control question was asked to Dan Patrick McKinney, Tea Party last Monday or Tuesday, I guess.
Tuesday.
And his response, which was appropriate for Collin County, it sort of breaks down in the rural setting. But his response was that, well, sometimes your cities are out of control. And that's true for Plano. I can attest to that. And the other part of his answer was that you had your HD reps that were very close to the citizens, and they would handle the local control issue.
Gotcha. Good point. Good point. Okay. Additional objections. Removing a revenue source is disruptive. That's true. I mean, all change is disruptive. Even change for the better. As an engineer, right, familiar with systems, right? When you plug an AC plug into a wall outlet, suddenly you put an immediate load right on the electrical system, and you immediately apply a step function power. Well, it turns out any system, whether it's electrical or plumbing or a society or an economy, if you introduce instantaneous change, which in mathematics is called a stepwise function, right? It goes from 0 to some value. That produces what's called an impulse response. That's a zero-width response with an infinite magnitude. And in general, in layman's terms, that breaks things, okay? And so if you introduce a stepwise change into a tax system, you can cause things to break. Sales tax revenue is more volatile than property tax revenue, right? The economy has a downturn, sales receipts go down. If we have some means of making sure that the municipalities are getting their money, whether they're retail, rich, or poor, they're still going to see less revenue on a down year. Well, if you and I need to tighten our budgets, shouldn't the taxing entities also be tightening their budgets?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Some sales are going to move to neighboring states. If you look at, for example, Oregon and Washington, one state has income tax and no sales tax, the other one has no income tax, or no sales tax and has income tax, right? And so people move back and forth. They live in one state, they shop in the other state. Well, that effect could take place, Oklahoma, Louisiana, maybe Mexico, but it's only going to see the border areas, and it's not going to be significant for the state. And finally, there's the argument businesses are going to leave Texas, right? Especially those retail businesses. Well, Walmart's going to move out of Texas. Well, the businesses are going to continue to move to Texas because we reduce tax and regulatory burden. People are going to spend money. If I didn't misunderstand one of the comments made yesterday, I think it was a Southwest Airlines rep, was saying that the property tax levied on Southwest as a commercial entity in Texas includes a tax on its major machinery, which is its airplanes, okay? And so if we abolish property tax in Texas, then commercial entities would see their operating costs fall dramatically, okay? And I think that would create a powerful incentive. All right, let's move on to what can you do? Well, first of all, we've been talking about Sandy.
Can I say something one thing? With regards to the property tax and the appraisal, the government is establishing the value of the home and then the tax. If you tax the items, the government would not be establishing the price of an apple. So I think this is one of the big things about government. They have too much control.
That's a great point. So Sandy is pointing out that if you move from property tax, in which the government plays a role in approximating the value of your home, and that ultimately leads to a tax rate, a tax burden, a tax bill. If you switch to sales tax, who's determining the value of the things that you are buying? Well, it's the seller, right? The government is no longer in that process. So it's a reduction in government control. That's her point. Thanks, Cindy. We've been talking about this committee that met yesterday, and it's been meeting over the state. It met in Lubbock. It's going to be meeting, I think, in San Antonio next. Its full name, not even correct here, it's the Senate Select Committee on Property Tax Relief and Reform. Okay? And I've got a couple of URLs in here. If you're familiar with tiny URLs, just remember tinyurl.com. And all of these shortcut links begin with prop tax. Right? So I got to remember the last three characters, SSC. So the website for the Select Committee is prop tax SSC. So take a look at that. They got documents from each of the previous hearings, and I think they've got video recordings. Yesterday's testimony was live cast and recorded on the state legislative site. Barbara, what's the high-level web name for that? Do you recall?
You know what? I have it bookmarked, and I can just tell you how to get there when you get to their homepage.
Okay, all right. If you Google it, give me a moment, Sandy.
/archive at the end, and you pick up all of the.
It'll pick up the rest of it. Okay, archive. Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, right? His Senate campaign I mentioned earlier. He really wants to abolish or reform property tax. If I'm not mistaken, what was the gal's name that ran for governor? Medina? Deborah Medina. I think she was also a strong proponent. So they got some resonance. As a lieutenant governor during his campaign, he advocated the reduction of property tax burden, and he continues to advocate property tax reform. It turns out that there's pretty hard evidence that the Texas Municipal League and other organizations that have essentially Agenda 21 ties are pushing the taxing entities to dig in their heels and not consider any types of reform, certainly not abolishment of property tax. So Dan Patrick, when he took the microphone on Wednesday, wanted to speak directly to both the public as well as those taxing entities what his objectives are. His objectives are in line with what I've pointed out here, to bring the property tax burden in line with people's incomes and to also align them with budgets that really reflect what ultimately ought to be a zero-based budgeting approach. That is, we fund municipalities and school districts, et cetera, based on what they need to spend. And Senate District 30 is Van Taylor. Do we have, or excuse me, SD8, I'm sorry, SD8. Who's the senator for 30?
Estes.
Estes, right. So Van Taylor is on the select committee. Contact him, and if your state senator is Estes, also let him know where you stand on this issue of property tax. I'd like to acknowledge a number of people that have taken time out of their busy schedules over the past few months and allowed me to bend their ears. Chris Hill, Jody Laubenberg, Jeff Leach, Keith Self I didn't meet with personally, but if you're on his mailing list, he's been writing recently about property tax with respect to the county level. Florence Shapiro, I was very surprised that she graciously hobbled in with a broken ankle to meet with me for a couple of hours and talk about this topic, and Van Taylor. And finally, here are the references that I promised. Property Tax System Basics is a great place to start. Just remember the word basics at the end of that URL. That'll take you to the Central Appraisal District website and give you some details. Keeping your property tax bill in check. That is the Texas Public Policy Foundation document, and they have other information out there. Prop 13, there's a lot out there, but I picked one. which is this prop tax 13 URL. And finally, the freedom to own property. And by own property would mean you don't rent property, you own it. You stay in your property and you don't have to pay anybody because you're there. Tiny URL, prop tax free. Thank you for your time.